Hello, everyone. Welcome to City Parks Alliance's 2019 webinar series. Today's webinar, Funding Brownfields to Parks, is the 7th of our 2019 season and will focus on funding sources and strategies that can be used to help transform brownfield sites into parks and community spaces. Presentations will share information about specific projects, the strategies that got them funded, and brownfields funding opportunities in general. My name is Steve Burrington. I'm the Executive Director of Groundwork USA. I'm pleased to be your moderator for today's session. If you're interested in continuing education credits for this webinar for AICP or LACES, watch for a follow-up email in the next week with instructions on how to claim your credits. On behalf of City Parks Alliance, we'd like to thank the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for its sponsorship support of the webinar series on funding parks. So this webinar will explore both specific projects that utilize brownfield funding and the general federal funding framework for brownfields transformation. Speakers from Groundwork Lawrence in Massachusetts, Catalyst Collaboratives, a consulting firm, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization will discuss brownfields funding opportunities and issues, along with community engagement and partnership strategies needed to access funding and the impacts that brownfields to parks projects can have on low-income communities. Our speakers will focus on ways you can move forward with assessing and remediating potential brownfield sites to create parks and community spaces. And in particular, they'll focus on how to identify and access various funding sources, how to engage the community to ensure a project reflects community priorities and will have momentum as you pursue funding, and how to build partnerships that can overcome challenges and bring projects to fruition. Whether you're in a small, mid-sized, or large city, we hope today's session will provide you with some new ideas, tools, and strategies to transform brownfields into parks and community spaces. Our first speaker is Ann Carroll, who's been with the US EPA Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization in Washington, D.C. since 2002. Working on brownfields projects and special initiatives. Ann's worked for over 30 years on environmental and public health protection, focusing on lead poisoning prevention, risk communication, and contaminated site cleanup, both domestically and internationally. Following Ann's presentation, we'll hear from Leslie Melendez and Kate O'Brien. Leslie is the Deputy Director of Groundwork Lawrence. In addition to over 8 years in her role at Groundwork Lawrence, she served on numerous volunteer boards and on the City of Lawrence Planning Board, both as a voting member and later as chair, and she's currently the chair of the City of Lawrence Licensing Commission. Kate O'Brien is a consultant at Catalyst Collaboratives and supports mission-driven teams as they navigate the complexity of driving equitable social change in their organizations, communities, and institutions. In her previous role as senior advisor at Groundwork USA, Kate worked on a pilot evaluation of how participation in green space projects affected health and well-being in communities across Groundwork UA's national network. While Leslie and Kate are going to focus on an initial brownfields to park project in Lawrence for its value in showing how a community can get started, I'll note that the project was just the first of a long series of other successful brownfields to parks projects that the Lawrence community has carried out in subsequent years. We'll hear all of our speaker presentations before moving to question and answers. We have a great turnout today, and to ensure that we can respond to everyone as questions or technical difficulties arise, here are some tips. To ask a question, click the text box underneath the question toolbar on your GoToWebinar control panel. Type the question in the box and make sure to click send. Feel free to send questions throughout the presentations, but please know we'll be holding them until the end. If you experience a technical problem during the presentation, please type it in the question box and send it to us. And finally, if you miss anything, don't worry. Links to the presentations, the recording, and copies of documents referred to during the webinar are going to be emailed to all registrants. So let's get started. And Ann, you can take it away.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today, and hopefully you are now seeing my full screen. And in our dry run, I did hear from others that this might be a small screen. So encourage those of you, if it looks small, go to the panel in the top right corner and you can actually make the screen larger to suit your needs. So without further ado, I'm here to introduce brownfields. And let's start with their definition. Brownfields, as defined by statute, is real property that has either real or perceived contamination. But this really is a kind of a common language definition, which is it's a property that is contaminated or is perceived to be contaminated. And by virtue of either that recognition of contamination or that perception, communities, investors, developers aren't really interested because they're afraid they're going to get some kind of toxic soup. And so the Brownfield grant really went to those communities to help them overcome those barriers and put those sites back into productive reuse. Sometimes brownfields are actually defined as what they aren't. So they are not Superfund sites or CERCLA's national priorities list, if you're familiar with that terminology. They are not other federal facility properties that are owned or controlled by the U.S. government. And they are not sites that are undergoing any kind of active federal or state environmental enforcement. Sometimes seeing the example helps you see what a brownfield is. So they're former industrial, commercial, or residential sites. They could be the strip mall because it has a dry cleaner where spills or operations resulted in contamination. They could be drug labs or sites contaminated with controlled substances. They could be low-risk sites that had contaminated petroleum products. So think of that as maybe an abandoned or vacant gas station. Mine-scarred lands is another kind of potentially defined brownfields. And so the Brownfields program really started as a sort of pilot program under the Superfund program in the mid-90s, because the Superfund program was dealing with the most kind of contaminated and dangerous sites, and the questions that were being posed by communities, lenders, elected officials, residents of these sites is, well, what about the rest of them? Not everything is at the top of the heap, but they still might pose a risk. And so that's where the Brownfields program kind of evolved as a pilot program to look at those lower risk or no known risk sites. And so it started as a pilot program under Superfund, and with the passage of the Brownfields amendments to CERCLA in 2002, we became an official program with our own statutory authorities and appropriations. And so that happened in 2002, and it expanded the Brownfield program. And then since then, we actually had a statutory reauthorization last spring as part of the omnibus bill. And so that was called the BUILD Act that was passed in March 2018, and it further expanded the Brownfields program. And I'll tell you a little bit about those expansions next. So the typical brownfield site, as you might imagine, if it was an abandoned gas station or some old shopping mall, it has petroleum fuels and hydrocarbons are often reported as contaminants, lead or other metals, asbestos maybe from those older structures, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Those are the products of incomplete combustion, so around areas that had power plants or railroads or even areas that had other kinds of burning activities. Volatile organic compounds, for example, those dry cleaning solvents, as well as pesticides, either because there was some kind of agricultural activity or it was an area where kind of historically now banned pesticides were installed in foundations. And so there's a process for brownfields, and the grants that the EPA awards competitively every year are there to help the communities go through the process. And so because it's either a contaminated or perceived contaminated site, you have to find out what is there about the history of that site that suggests it could be contaminated. Was it a power plant? Was it an area where there was railroad activities or some other kind of commercial and industrial activity, you know, historically associated with contamination? Or is it just older structures? Or has there been illegal dumping? And so a brownfield assessment grant will help the community not only look at that individual site, but maybe look into an area that has multiple sites or multiple perceived sites. And that also involves community and public participation. So helping the community identify those sites having that kind of interaction with them as you're going through the process of finding and identifying sites. Site investigation that really looks at the property records, looks at environmental records and public health records locally, talks to the neighbors, and then eventually, you know, if there's information that suggests there's contamination, you'll want to get into the sampling. And so then you'll want to have an environmental professional to help you support that, you know, sampling in accordance with EPA and state and local requirements. And so those also involve public participation. And as you can see, I won't go through all the steps, but again, the step process and the EPA Brownfield grants help with site assessment, site cleanup, and there's also a new grant that was introduced recently that it's called a multi-purpose grant that does both assessment and cleanup within the grant. Our money does not fund the redevelopment, but most other sources of funding are really excited that EPA Brownfields money went into the front end of the project. So that's usually an attractor for other kinds of funding and leverage. And a key point of both the assessment and the cleanup, having a vision for what the reuse is, because that really informs what your assessment is going to be looking for and what your cleanup is going to be targeting. Because you want to be thinking about how are people going to move on that property. You know, is it going to be in a foreshore area? Is it an area that you're going to turn into a playground or a park? And so that will influence where it is you want to make sure that everything is clean and safe for reuse. And so here's just an overarching slide that talks both about the types of grants that EPA awards and offers, as well as the technical assistance that both the EPA provides directly through our regional offices. Our state and tribal programs might also offer locally, but also the third-party entities that we fund that also can provide technical assistance. And as I've said, you have one-on-one assistance, and then those EPA professionals that, you know, are also out there and can provide some technical assistance. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say that we actually have a national Brownfields training conference every year, and that's another place where people can get information and join our happy family. And so this is just a summary of the types of grants that we award, and I'll go into and have some slides in detail about each of them, but I won't talk about them, but that's for you to pursue. And so assessment grants, as I said, the multiple steps of assessment. Revolving loan fund is essentially to set up a pool of funds that can both make loans and also make sub-grants for the cleanup. But the idea as a revolving loan fund is those loans will get paid back, and that will provide further funds for further cleanup activities. A cleanup grant is a site-specific activity. Multi-purpose covers both. Environmental workforce development and job training is our grant with workforce development boards or community colleges, and that helps those community residents begin to develop the skills and training so that they can participate in cleaning up, assessing, and healing their own neighborhood. And then, excuse me, we also award state and tribal grants non-competitively annually. And so, again, because this is a really important concept, you have to have a clear vision of how you're going to reuse the site as you engage in that process. And that can be something that you develop in the course of your initial assessment, but you wouldn't want to proceed too far down the project life without having a clear idea of what you're building towards and what that safe reuse is that you're looking for. And so that goes into some of the details about the dollars and who's eligible, and I think all of these materials will be downloadable for you. A key point is the red type, which lets you know that there's an open solicitation right now. And so the proposals are due to the, and you can get the guidelines for those proposals on our website, and they are due on December 3rd. So if you can't manage that this year, it's never too early to be pulling together the partners that might be a part of a future competition proposal. Cleanup grants, again, that's to clean up individual sites, again, who's eligible and the funding, and there is also a solicitation open for that too. Revolving loan fund, I mentioned, that's setting up a pool of funds for cleanup. And so that can be for multiple sites, and kind of continuing over time as funds are repaid. The pool gets replenished. Also open. Environmental workforce development and job training. If this is of interest to you, if this is something that you and your partners are, I encourage you to take a look at some of the materials on our website. And the multi-purpose grants, which is not a part of this solicitation right now, but we anticipate it will be available next year. State and tribal grants, essentially states and tribes are our co-implementers of Brownfields activities, and so we also provide them non-competitive funds to help them stand up, establish, and enhance their programs. The technical assistance, so this is the EPA actually funding third-party entities and who are geographically based to help support community needs. And so if you look at those regions, and you might be familiar with some of them, there's actually a map on our website. And so you can see who would be the technical assistance provider in your area, and anybody who's interested in Brownfields is welcome to contact them. And so I have a couple of different examples of former Brownfields, now parks and public green spaces, just to get your thinking about the art of the possible. These are some past sites that have actually been reused. And so you don't usually think of, former bulk oil facilities as areas that you want to put a park. On the other hand, we all know that many of those kinds of industrial and commercial activities were often along waterways. We also know that they're great park settings. You just have to overcome that little issue of cleanup before the conversion. But this is an award-winning park in Columbia, Missouri. I added some additional examples. People may not realize that the High Line in New York City actually received some Brownfield grants to clean up the railroad trestle bridge. Similarly, the Beltline in Atlanta, another famous park, which also was on a former rail corridor, and we provided some funds to assist with the cleanup and assessment of that. One I really like to showcase was a project in partnership with the National Park Service, which is the Selma to Montgomery Historic Trail. And essentially, we both offered technical assistance and grants to clean up and provide some walking and historic trails along that route. And then some other examples that are might be of interest to you, and I've included the links there, both in Ohio and in Missouri. Here's another example from an area of large vacant parcels in Missouri. And so working with the city, the sewer district, and the Green City Coalition, we developed a plan so that they could demolish a number of vacant properties and also create a larger kind of 9-acre contiguous vacant parcel park area. So this is the Brownfields and EPA's Cleanups in My Community page. And so don't be alarmed, because some of those yellow dots are areas where the investigation is still going. So this is where Brownfields grant money has gone. We don't know that all of those are Brownfields that are going to require cleanup, but they're all receiving some of our funds to do some assessment or cleanup activity. So take heart. We have been trying to kind of highlight how Brownfields reuses can contribute to healthy communities. We often think only about the brown part, not that those brownfields are going to turn into something beautiful and productive in the future. And so our new story map really highlights parks as one of the reuses that contributes and helps to create healthy communities. So I encourage you to take a link off of that and check out the other examples we have there. And I wouldn't be an EPA employee if I didn't give you the shameless plug for the National Brownfields Conference. Is coming up soon, and I hope some of you will come and introduce yourselves in Los Angeles in December. Thank you. Hello?
Thanks, Anne, for a great roadmap to the Brownfields redevelopment process and to EPA funding opportunities. I'll remind everybody who's listening today that you don't need to have taken notes on everything that Anne just covered. The slides will be available and will be a great resource to you as you start to dig into the possibilities. Also, please make sure to send in your questions on the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. Anytime, we'll be sorting through them all and turning to them at the end of the next presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Kate and Leslie. Please take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate O'Brien, and I'm with Catalyst Collaboratives, and have spent about 18 years working within the Groundwork family. So this is a project near and dear to my heart, and I'm joined by my former colleague but lifelong friend, Leslie Melendez, who's Deputy Director at Groundwork Lawrence. We're going to dive in today to a case study about Dr. Nina Scarito Park. It is a former Brownfield site, and this array of pictures before you is indicative of the transformation, but pales in comparison to the real life people power that it took to get this thing done. So a little bit of context. So first to begin, this is Lawrence, Massachusetts, an aerial view. This is the Great Merrimack River that powered many of the mill buildings in the industry that allowed this city to be created. It was the first planned industrial city in the United States, very densely built, as you can tell, walkable by design. So the housing for mill workers was right adjacent, so you could walk and stay very close to the workplace. Home to the Bread and Roses strike in 1912, so the first, one of the first major labor movements in the United States. So this industrial history provides clues about the environmental legacy from the Industrial Revolution that led to the contamination and conditions found all over Lawrence. And this is another view. We're zooming in now into the North Common neighborhood. So that is still the Merrimack River that you see kind of running left to right. And the area that we're talking about is the North Common neighborhood, sort of the whitish area. And the Spigot River flows through that area and kind of creates that wavy line there. This was all part of this project. The Nina Scarito Park project was, in a wider context, part of the Reviviendo Gateway Initiative, which was a kickoff of an intentional partnership between Groundwork Lawrence and Lawrence Community Works. That was a CDC focused in that area. And they were asking a really fundamental question, and it had many sort of rabbit holes of big ideas and visions coming out of it. But one fundamental question was, in the very center of that picture, you can see the GenCorp Oxford paper site. That was a brownfield cleanup to the tune of about $22+ million, many of it federal dollars, to do that cleanup, and with great promise and hope for revitalization of the adjacent neighborhood, which is definitely the lowest income, poorest, and most densely populated neighborhood in the city. And so, we dug into that question and thought, how can we leverage more comprehensive and more equitable outcomes from this major brownfield cleanup and redevelopment? So it's within that context that we're looking at the Scarito Park project, formerly known as the Brook Street site. It's Leslie to get into the details, but it's that crescent shape right inside that red circle there. And this is in the North Common neighborhood, again, just adjacent to the Mill District downtown. And I'm going to turn it over to Leslie to talk a little bit about how this project got going and sort of how we transformed it. Take it away, Leslie.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for that context. So as you can see, this is a conceptual drawing. This was the vision that was happening in living rooms of folks that lived in that neighborhood. They wanted to know what they could do and how they could work together to really pull this together and have this project done. So this is what they came up with. This was that first idea. Next slide. And as we think about what was happening, one of the things that was clear was that there was a vision, there was a plan for a larger conversation and a larger project to happen. This being the first of that greenway, of the Spigot River Greenway that folks had been talking about for a really long time. And this particular project really created those new possibilities. This was the beginning of some many wonderful other projects that happened in the city. But let's take a look into what it took and what happened. So the Spigot River at the Brook Street area it's a hidden jewel. This is when I remember showing these pictures and people are like, oh, that's in Lawrence? And we were like, yep, that's in Lawrence. That's in your backyard. So it was really important for us to give folks the opportunity to understand that they had these beautiful assets in their midst, and they had been kind of missed for a long time. So the site in and of itself, 2.7 acres. It was adjacent to, multifamily housing. It was an industrial laundry before it was this vacant lot. And it had been vacant for over 20 years before we actually were able to start having conversations about what it was, what it would take to revitalize it. I mean, and it is, as we think about our environmental justice history, it was ground zero for us. It was the lowest income area, the highest density, and, it had the highest density of the majority of the minority folks here in Lawrence. Circa 2001, these maps kind of illustrate the disparities that were taking place in Lawrence in a very different way. The GIS maps that were created through our partners over at Lawrence Community Works and MIT really focused in on the visual and how we could use these maps to help further the conversation. There's a very unmistakable pattern that you can see of the density of the neighborhoods and where the green spaces are and where the green spaces are not. And it was really important to the folks that were having these conversations on many different levels that we changed that picture. So we'll talk a little bit about the site, the history of the site. So the history of the Brook Street site in and of itself, again, it was an industrial laundry that the building was taken down after a fire. 20 years later, it was still cordoned off, and folks really didn't have access to it. But as you can see, the Spigot River, it meandered throughout the city of Lawrence, and it was this beautiful space, and people enjoyed it. Unfortunately, in the late 1800s, what happened was that they channelized the spigot, and they channelized the spigot to harness, obviously, the power of the water, as they were trying to harness the power of the other two rivers, but also to make it easier to transport trash from the most northern part of the city out to the Merrimack. So in the 1940s, the site was redeveloped into an industrial commercial laundry, and then subsequently in the 80s, when a lot of things were happening here in Lawrence, a lot of buildings were being demolished. There was a lot of fires happening here in Lawrence. So there was a lot of vacant land in Lawrence that folks just didn't want to have anything to do with because they didn't understand what was there. So then flash forward a few years. In 1986, we found out that the property had in 1986, there was about $1.8 million owed in back taxes. In the early 90s, the owner began a process of assessment and cleanup. And then in 2000, the site was identified as a redevelopment site for the neighborhood and the local CDC. And it was a conversation that really came up from folks talking about, my kid plays in that big vacant lot that's back there. And Lawrence Community Works was looking at properties to redevelop for housing, and the history of the site in and of itself came out, and folks were like, oh, wait, no, your children shouldn't be playing back there. It really needs to be looked at to see what the contaminants are because of what was there before. So that was the strategy, right? We started talking to folks in the neighborhoods and trying to engage folks in that conversation to really take ownership of the spaces that they had. In 2002, Groundwork had its first Spigot River cleanup, and we pulled out 15 tons of trash from the riverbanks. Even in the water, there were some folks that actually got in the water. And flash forward 19 years today, and there are still some folks that love to get in the water. But hundreds of volunteers came out, and as this cleanup has grown and really taken on a life of its own over the last 19 years. We've had upwards of 700 volunteers, mainly youth, really get their hands dirty and get into the Spigot River to be a part of the community, a part of the change. We also had some strategies, right? We had to really get folks in on the design, but first they needed to understand what the limitations were, what they could do. Funding is a big piece of that, but also the levels of contaminant and what could happen there. So Groundwork and the project teams brought folks together to start designing a plan. And then, there were some things that had to happen In addition to that, we had there had to be this conversation around who did what. And one of the things that Groundwork is really proud of, the work that we do here in the community, is that we're able to be that facilitator, to bring different folks to the table that at times just weren't talking to each other. There was a high taxes on the property, and the mayor's office and the municipality really wanted to get paid, but there was an opportunity for an amnesty program. Then there was the opportunity for the site being acquired and transferred to the city, but not before the bank that acquired the site was able to pledge to continue to honor those commitments, and be able to have some funds leveraged towards the building of the park. But that all happened, and then we're ready to build this park and to put in for some grants for the park, and Groundwork discovered that the city was out of compliance with their open space plan. So then we moved forward and we launched into, how do we fix this? How do we make this happen? Launched an open space planning process for the first time in over 20 years, applied for the grant once the open space plan was complete, and then worked with others in the community to really talk to and meet with our local city councilors to be able to get them to buy into the process and the project, and to really support it in a way that was coming from their constituents, but also coming from other municipal players as well. So then we move on, and there's a covenant not to sue put in place and signed by both the bank and the Attorney General's office. The city does approve taking ownership of the site. It was a very big night. We had lots of residents fill up City Hall, just to show that there was a coalition behind this, that the residents really wanted this. And then we put the project out to bid, and in 2006, we cut the ribbon, and it was a really amazing opportunity for us as an organization and as a community to really have come together and produce this beautiful space that once wasn't anything more than that vacant lot you just saw. So the vision and then the reality in 2006 when we did the ribbon cutting. And, you know, the process was really about listening to what residents wanted and needed. And, you know, they talked about community gardens. They talked about play spaces, safe play spaces for their children. And that's what we were able to do by pulling in all of these resources together. And it wasn't just monetary resources, but other resources as well. But all of that didn't happen without some challenges. And I'm going to kick it right back over to Kate, and she's going to talk a little bit about the challenges and the opportunities that came along with that.
Great. Thanks so much, Leslie. It's so funny to be reliving this. It still feels like yesterday. It's kind of amazing. So there are a number of challenges, and we just wanted to make those a little bit more explicit. The fact that Lawrence was a company town, so founded by a set of mill owners who, you know, carved up the city into lots that it later handed over to the city, handed over deeds and streets and some of the alleyways and some of the other assets related to how the mills are powered with water power were not deeded over. And so there's kind of this lingering legacy of who owns what and who's responsible for maintenance of what. And vacant lots certainly have gotten wrapped up in that. And that's something that we have worked aggressively to kind of course correct over the past 20 years. Significant environmental justice issues. So Lawrence's population is over 70% Puerto Rican and Dominican Republic, people hailing from those countries. So these are major issues. And so there is over 3,000 vacant lots at that time. Many of them were contaminated and or questionable, and certainly locked up from a redevelopment perspective. So there's definitely inequitable distribution of burdens and benefits. And as you saw those GIS maps earlier, there was not a lot of open space investment happening in the northern part of the city. And so that was where we really developed the mandate with residents and community members and our partner organizations to prioritize investments along the Spigot River that flowed through those neighborhoods that needed those park spaces most. When this project was first a very kernel of a vision that was growing out of living rooms and out of people's thinking aspirationally, there was a pretty low capacity inside City Hall. So we were coming out of a time when the tax base was really low, pretty decimated by a number of vacant and abandoned properties. A lot of people have moved out, like sort of the white flight pattern that you have seen in many other cities was certainly true in Lawrence. The lack of open space plan, and that we were out of compliance with the state, and there was significant funding from the state. And I know that's not true in all 50 states, but in Massachusetts, we're fortunate to have significant funds to develop new parks and to rehab them. So that ineligibility really kind of hamstrung Lawrence for many years, and was sort of wrapped up also in this whole scare resources mentality, that there was some reality to that, but there's also a stigma both inside and outside about the kind of place that Lawrence is and isn't. And that's also kind of, as we're reclaiming vacant properties and contaminated properties like this, we're also reclaiming the identity and the narrative about Lawrence and about what it means to be a community. And this unprecedented scope was one of these galvanizing things. And I would say, just to kind of pivot on that, we really viewed challenges and opportunities. And I think that's a real hallmark of Groundwork, but also a hallmark of the success of this kind of a project. That the funding opportunity, but for our lack of compliance with the state to get the major source of funding to bring it all together, created a sense of urgency, really got people kind of moving in a different way. Major history of community organizing, certainly, culturally, and also just in the history of the city, that was sort of the tapped into the zeitgeist around this kind of an idea. There was other vacant land reclamation projects happening. Lawrence Community Works was a major partner for Groundwork Lawrence, and so it was the two of our organizations together developed strong relationships with the city. Also had significant mapping, data analysis, and planning and fundraising capacity that we were able to use to leverage all kinds of resources. And so that nonprofit municipal partnership, along with private land ownership, was really essential to getting a whole different host of sources together. And so that was an opportunity, because in 2001, if you think about a 20-year arc of time where you're practicing how to get fundraising together and how to align your mission and vision and reality, that is a tremendous way to build social capital and civic infrastructure that is lasting, that will be time tested. And we saw and tapped that over and over again in the years since, after we were doing more of those projects. So really, this impossibility of the vision was the biggest opportunity for all of us. It helped us grow our relationships stronger. So just, I guess, to touch on that a little bit more, we invested deeply in all kinds of relationships. So with the municipality, that was everything from, going and bringing coffee and donuts to the guys at the DPW yard to figure out when they could get, dumpsters for our Spigot River cleanups. Could we get the tipping fees donated for those from the dump? And what would it take to do that? And so there's a lot of, just kind of building relationships, talking about people's kids, and, talking about comparing notes about the dog, and, those kinds of things. You can't put a timeline on that, but I can't overstate it enough. It's incredibly important. We did that with the mayor's office. We did that with staff inside City Hall. Really, anybody that we could talk to about this project, we did, and it really repaid us pretty handsomely. Not in dollars, but, well, I guess in dollars for the park. Also, we just value add however possible. So we were really enterprising, we were opportunistic. Anytime we saw a grant possibility, we were thinking about the different angles and how we could pitch it in a way. And I won't go into too many details, but there are a couple of examples of using money from sort of water resources management and thinking about watersheds. And of course, this is a riverfront property, and so we were able to secure some funding to manage stormwater and water cleanliness, and got a grant that helped support keeping someone in the chair and keeping a staff person moving through the project, even if it wasn't necessarily explicitly funded. And that using that interconnected systems thinking really helped us kind of think about, how is this all related? This is a larger vision. It's just not one park, it's a series of parks along a greenway. And that was a really incredibly compelling vision, that we were developing a pipeline, that we had a pipeline of ideas, and that we had a growing legion of people who were supporting it and willing to put in sweat equity, pulling tires out of the river, doing childcare for meetings, all of that. And of course, don't ever give up. That's, can't say enough about that too. The funding for Cerrito Park, to put it mildly or simply, is took a patchwork quilt of funding sources. So CDBG was a significant match for the urban self-help, now called the Park Grant Program from the state. You saw a 75-25 match. So the city used its discretionary CDBG funds, but Groundwork Lawrence also competed for some of those smaller CDBG grants to do youth programming, community garden programming on that site as well. The tax amnesty program certainly brought people to the table, and then philanthropy. So in the early years before this project even got going, we had local, regional, and community foundations providing staff resources for our staff support to do all the homework and the legwork about what it would take and all the organizing, and private donations, and then also the bank, who was the site owner also. And finally, I would say that, you know, it's not one single person or one single entity that gets these things done. It's not just about money. That partnership makes things much more possible. So public, private, nonprofit partnerships are essential to getting this done. And with that, I will hand it off to my colleagues.
Thanks, Leslie and Kate. And I'll just remind everyone who's listening and watching today that they've zeroed in on the Nina Cerrito Park because the specifics of that and its catalytic role in the city are particularly instructive. But that was just the beginning of what's now going on toward 2 decades of park development in Lawrence, heading toward $30 million worth of investment now, and a real transformation of not only the landscape in the city, but a lot of other wonderful things in the community as well. So the question box has been filling up, and I'm going to begin with a couple of questions for Ann Carroll about funding, and then we'll turn to some for Kate and Leslie about lessons to be learned from their experience. And one listener asks, what role do state brownfield coordinators play in assessment and cleanup funding? And do the states have separate funding to award beyond the EPA programs?
Yes, thank you for those questions. So it very much depends on the state, and it very much depends on the project. So, for example, sometimes states will actually apply for brownfield grants just so that they are available to help, small towns and villages maybe that won't have the capacity to manage, either the assessment or the cleanup activities. And so in some instances, the state will apply for the funds on behalf of the community. In some instances, the community will apply for the funds and be successful, and then will, very much work under the wing of the state or tribal program. And then in some instances, and it really is, again, state and site specific and also reuse specific. For example, in the city of Chicago, they have a large program. They have staff who are professionals who've been working on brownfields for a number of years. They might not need the same level of interaction with the state. Obviously they'd want to follow the rules and everything, but they could do a lot of the work that would be required independently. And so, it becomes a question of the capacity of the community that's seeking the brownfield grant, the specifics of this. Is it a big site? Is it a badly contaminated site, or is it, only mildly contaminated and won't need the same level of reuse kind of scrutiny and oversight. And obviously, if it's going to be reused in a way that's going to have sensitive populations like a child care center, there might be a higher level of oversight and scrutiny than a different kind of reuse. Some states do have grants. It very much depends on whether their state legislature has given them the additional funds or separate revenue sources. And sometimes it's not so much that they're awarding grants, but they're providing some free technical assistance. I hope that answers your questions.
Yes, and another question for you about grants. Is there a limit to how many EPA grants a grantee can apply for?
Yes, and it's grant specific, so I encourage you to check out the grant solicitation. I put the link in the chat box, and it will be available, or you can just go to the EPA web page, www.epa.gov/brownfields, and there's a grants, type of grants, and that will lead you to the solicitation page.
And then for Leslie and Kate, how did the site improvements at Dr. Nina Scarito Park get paid for?
Thanks, Steve. So there was a combination of various sources. So as we indicated on that last slide, it was paid for through grant funding, foundation funding, funding from the municipality, and funding from the owner of the property at the time, which was Bank of America. Kate, you have anything else to add in there?
Yeah, those are the primary sources. I think I would say there's also like community foundations, particularly in the early years, were extremely important for us to do project development. So there was a lot of speculation about what was on the site. No one in 2001 knew who owned the site. It was fenced off and forgotten. There was sort of the land records at City Hall were pretty scarce, and there was no kind of trail following breadcrumbs, as it were. We found out that it was a holding company in Texas owned it, and they didn't even know they owned it. And then also the learning curve in 2001, we knew almost nothing about brownfields, and so the EPA Brownfields program was just getting its legs under it. So everyone was learning so much at that time, and that took significant staff time. It took significant resources. So I want to make sure we think about like sort of not just the park itself, the hard costs, but also the soft costs, because those were really critical to making the project happen.
Leslie, I'll direct this next question to you. What changes have you seen in the surrounding neighborhood, and how has the park been sustained over the last 14 years?
Thanks, Steve. So the neighborhood, Lawrence is it has a very interesting characteristic that many of the gateway cities do here in Massachusetts, and then it is that it is a very transient community. People don't stay here for long periods of time. In fact, the folks that were the original folks that helped us organize in that neighborhood no longer live in that neighborhood. So there's lots of change and there's lots of turnover, but what we have seen is that as folks are moving into the neighborhood, they're taking ownership of the space. They're still using the space. We use the space regularly in our cleanups as a site, but we also do tours along the Spigot River Greenway from the start of the Greenway to the Merrimack to show people to showcase the different parks along the Greenway and the work that's been done. So although it continues to be used, and it's just being used now by a different group of people that have moved into the neighborhood.
And then there's a question, and I will try to capture this accurately, about solid waste under the soil 6 feet or more below the surface. What has been your experience with that? How did you tackle the contamination down there? How did you get it cleaned up, and what funding sources were used?
Was that for me, or was that for Kate and Leslie?
I think that's for Kate and Leslie.
Okay, great.
So, so this is Kate, and so the early years when we figured out who owned the site, we figured out that a bank had owned it, and we had probably a year or so of negotiations where we brought residents along with us as staff to the table, and sort of talked about the vision, brought that schematic you saw earlier, that crescent shape with a lot of green and sort of the big idea. And we spoke with them about it and said, we see trees, this is a riverfront park, we see a kayak launch and a basketball court and a casita and a place to cook out and a place to, grow food. And it took this bank a long time, their staff people a long time, to realize that we didn't want to just have a capped site, that we didn't want to just have it be paved over and just kind of, have some benches and kind of, things just plop down there. That we were talking about wholesale removing the soil and getting it all cleaned up. The bank started costing that out and decided that it would make the commitment to doing cleanup per our vision for creating the park there that had new soil and trees, and we could plant things and grow and have a safe, healthy spot. Then the bank went through another merger and acquisition and became acquired by Bank of America. And we had to negotiate with all new people. So it took us another 9 or 10 months of conversations with the bank to say, hey, look, we'd had these conversations with the previous landowner, and I hope you'll do the right thing and kind of make the same commitment. They actually, to their credit, took it a step further and went back and did another health and human assessment on the site. They wanted to be triply sure that they understood all the contamination, all the issues. They paid for the cleanup from their coffers, and then set aside money in an escrow account to contribute to the cleanup of the park. So, to the construction of the park. So it was a very significant investment from a private landowner who acquired the site and had nothing to do with the contamination originally. It was mostly driven by the property owner. And then once it was cleaned up, and we had the support of the Attorney General's office, bringing all these parties together to make sure that there was, sort of binding agreements about if there were contamination or something, God forbid, happened down the road, that all parties, had worked hard to do the right thing and do cleanup, and that allowed us to transfer control and ownership of the property to the City of Lawrence.
So my next question, also let me pitch this to Leslie, is this. It has to do with the role and the sort of perspective of City Hall. Less than 20 years ago, you were working in a very low resource city with low capacity in city government, where tax revenues and jobs were the overwhelming priorities, starting outside of City Hall, looking for resources to be spent to redevelop this land as a park. And in a fairly short span of time, Lawrence has gone on to develop acre after acre of parks on former brownfields. And wondering if you can sort of sum up how green space came to get more respect or have more stature at City Hall, and what has it taken to keep it a priority in the face of the other needs that Lawrence continues to have?
That's a really loaded question, Steve, but I will do my best to answer it. So at the beginning, when we first started working on these projects and really focusing in on the environment and green space, yeah, and people still ask the same question: why are you spending money on parks when we need more police officers or more fire resources for a fire department or more resources for our school? And knowing that some of the funds that are actually set aside for green spaces are separate from those other funds. So it's not that we're taking away, but what we were trying to do is really give folks that sense of home and that sense of peace. And, flash forward 20 years, and we're talking about this in terms of social determinants of health and giving folks a safe space to enjoy, giving them a space to build social capital, giving them a space to be able to find some serenity and some quiet, giving children a space to play so they can stay fit and healthy. So it really took lots of conversation and relationship building. Being a lifelong Lawrence resident, helped in part of those conversations, right? Because I was able to talk to folks that were in positions of power within the community and within municipal government to be able to really pull people into conversations. And Kate can attest to this as well. One of the biggest things, I think, one of Groundwork's biggest strengths is that relationship building piece, and being able to maintain those relationships. This last mayor, the current sitting mayor, he's in his second term. When he first took office, his first comment to us was, I don't want to be known as the parks mayor. And here we are 6 years into his administration, and he is the parks mayor, because he has seen and understands the importance of these spaces for a community that's landlocked. Lawrence is 7 square miles with 3 rivers running through it. We have a 3% vacancy rate, occupant vacancy rate in the city. That means there's no apartments available and there's no places to build. So the work that Groundwork has done is to protect the open spaces that we do have as part of the work that we're doing with the city, so that we're balancing the two needs. But we're built out. There's no more space to go. So how do we continue to maintain the relationships in municipal government, provide support that we can, because our DPW department is so taxed and so under-resourced. So we do these large volunteer events and we do these stewardship events to help support DPW. So it really is all about that relationship and that taking care of one another so that we can continue doing the work that we do.
We have just a couple of minutes left, and so in light of the overwhelming importance of community involvement and visioning and building momentum outside City Hall as a foundation for building relationships with City Hall and elsewhere. And can you remind everyone what types of EPA Brownfields grants can be used for planning and community involvement?
So all of the EPA Brownfield grants require community involvement and public notice. For planning, as you might well imagine, that's probably going to be the assessment grant, because you would want to be doing either planning for a specific site or planning for a multi-brownfield area earlier in the process. And so we do actually fund activities that might be kind of establishing an inventory of multiple sites, or it could be having those kind of community meetings as appropriate for the kind of community and culture of the neighborhoods, as well as, the standard sort of public meetings and town hall sort of things, city council gatherings. There are design charrettes and visioning that are also often incorporated as part of brownfield projects. And, we are working on having some more creative community engagement activities, but Groundwork really has shown a lot of leadership in kind of creative ways of gathering and generating youth involvement and youth support, and getting people that might not otherwise come out to public meetings to join and be a part of the visioning for Brownfield.
Thanks. Well, there is more in the question box, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So with that, I'll have to thank our speakers for their presentations today and their willingness to share and boil down a very complex story and a lot of hard work in transforming brownfields into parks and community spaces in Lawrence and in Ann's case elsewhere around the country. If you have additional questions, you can reach the speakers directly at the emails that are there on the screen, or you can email City Parks Alliance at info@cityparksalliance.org. And again, we'd like to thank the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for their sponsorship of this series. All webinars are listed on the City Parks Alliance website under the Events tab. You can check there for future webinars and registration information. And if you're a member, you'll also find the full webinar archive so you can view past recordings. Access to the webinars and the archive are just a few of the resources available to City Parks Alliance members. City Parks Alliance also offers city workshops, urban park study tours, a resource library, a job bank, and discounts on the biennial Greater and Greener conference. The next City Parks Alliance webinar will be on homelessness in parks and will take place in January. Stay tuned for more information about that. The webinar is free for members and exclusive to members. If you're not a member but would like to attend, please visit cityparksalliance.org/join or /join. And if you'd like to be the first to know when registration opens, subscribe to the email list, which you can find on the website. Again, within the next week, you'll receive an email with a link for today's presentation, a link giving you a chance to become a member, and links to various resources, and again, instructions on how to claim continuing education credits. So thanks again to all of you, all of the attendees and others, participants in today's session for helping to make this a great success. Please do take a minute to fill out the short evaluation that's about to pop up on the screen. And again, thank you for joining, and thank you for the great work you're doing in your communities in cities around the country.
Thank you.